Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Today we are concluding a really deep, I think pretty complex investigation into the life of King David.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be focusing specifically on the most controversial and I think widely misinterpreted aspects of his relationships.
Right, we're talking about the narratives involving Bathsheba, Jonathan, and the really tragic figure of Abishag.
Exactly. And these stories are just so foundational, not just for understanding the Old Testament, but for seeing how religious systems later on tried to justify, well, some very controversial practices by, selectively reading David's life.
That's precisely right. And our mission today is, I'd say, highly critical. We're really trying to move beyond the Sunday school summaries.
Yeah, the flannel board version.
Exactly. And we're using our source material, specifically the extensive analysis drawn from the 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy series, to really dissect how these scriptural accounts have been manipulated.
The primary ones being 2 Samuel 11 and 12.
Yes. The argument we're exploring is that far from justifying plural marriage, these narratives actually expose David's immense failures. Failures of lust, of power. And they demonstrate why holding him up as some kind of moral hero is, frankly, profoundly dangerous.
So we want to show you exactly why these stories should be read as cautionary tales.
That's the goal.
Okay, so to begin this deep dive, we have to establish the context for David's failure. And the Bible itself, it kind of provides the smoking gun right away.
It really does.
We're in 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. And it starts with this simple but, fatal observation. It came to pass, at the time when kings go forth to battle, David tarried still at Jerusalem.
That one line, it says so much.
It sets the entire stage for the tragedy. So why is this seemingly minor detail, David just staying home, why is that such a foundational crisis point?
Because it represents a complete abdication of his primary sacred duty. It's a total dereliction of his job.
His job as king.
Yes. If you look back at the origins of the monarchy in Israel, the entire reason the people demanded a king, which we see in 1 Samuel, was so the king could go out before us and fight our battles.
That was the job description.
That was the #1 job description. David's role was to be the commander-in-chief, out there leading his troops, sharing their hardship. So by choosing to stay behind in the comfort of his palace in Jerusalem, he had, in effect, stopped doing the single most important thing he was supposed to do.
And you get that classic combination, idle hands and immense unchecked power.
And that combination, as history shows us again and again, it's just a formula for absolute disaster.
And disaster arrived in the most visual way possible. The very next verse, David is walking on the roof of his palace and he sees a beautiful woman washing herself. And this is the moment that has been so culturally whitewashed, hasn't it? The source material we're looking at is intensely critical of how Bathsheba is so often portrayed.
Oh, absolutely. The cultural narrative, which gets reinforced all the time by popular media. The 1951 film David and Bathsheba is a classic example. But this trope is everywhere.
Right.
The trope is that Bathsheba was somehow complicit, that she was using her beauty or her visibility to tempt the king.
The seductress.
The seductress. And the source material just categorically rejects this. The argument is that blaming Bathsheba for, quote, simply living her life is a complete misplacement of accountability. It's victim blaming.
So if we just look purely at the text, David is the one, he's the initiator, he's the one making every choice here.
100%.
He saw her from his roof, which already implies, a position of power, looking down. But the sin happens when he decides to keep looking and then act.
That's right. The text is so clear. It says he saw her, he inquired about her, he learned she was married to Uriah the Hittite, and then he sent messengers and took her.
He took her. That's not a passive verb.
Not at all. He went from being, as the source vividly puts it, a peeping Tom, to leveraging the entire mechanism of royal power just to fulfill a momentary appetite. The argument is so clear. In any private situation, whether a woman is bathing or just existing, the responsibility lies entirely with the person of honor and power to look away.
And David just failed that simple test.
Completely.
And what we see next is the intentional nature of the sin. This wasn't, a crime of passion or some brief regretted lapse.
No.
He learns she's married, and he still took her, and she came into him, and he lay with her.
It was deliberate. It was calculated adultery. It was, frankly, a one-night stand motivated solely by satisfying lust. And it's just this immediate glaring example of the danger of his unchecked power.
But then the situation escalates catastrophically. The moment Bathsheba sends word to him,
I am with child.
that one message, it turns this, private sin of adultery into an existential political problem for David.
It does, and it forces him into the next, much darker stage of this whole thing, plotting.
Right. The cover-up. He tries that first. He calls Uriah back from the battlefield.
Under the guise of, hey, tell me how the war is going.
Right. And the goal was so simple. Just get Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife so the pregnancy can be blamed on the husband.
And that's where David's just complete lack of character is thrown into such sharp relief by Uriah's staggering honor.
It's an incredible contrast.
It is. Uriah refuses. He refuses to go home and enjoy comforts while his comrades, his brothers in arms, are out there sleeping in tents in the field. He famously says, the ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents. Shall I then go into mine house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife?
He shames David with his own integrity.
He does. Just by his simple adherence to duty and brotherhood, he exposes how far David has fallen.
And when that cover-up failed, David, he just goes to the next level. He moves beyond adultery and deceit into state-sanctioned murder. We really need to pause on this. The absolute moral gravity of this act. This is maybe the darkest thing David ever does.
It's just cold calculation. He forces Uriah, his loyal soldier, a man who just showed incredible integrity, to carry the sealed death warrant back to Joab, the military commander.
He carries his own death sentence.
He does, and Joab knowingly complied. He set Uriah up in the most dangerous position possible, guaranteeing his death in battle.
But the source makes a crucial point here that I think is often forgotten. It wasn't just Uriah.
No, it wasn't, and that is so important. David and Joab didn't just sacrifice Uriah. The text says they sacrificed other valiant warriors in the process.
Just to make it look plausible.
Just to make Uriah's death look like an accident of war and to assure the cover-up, it contaminates the entire military command. It betrays the trust of the entire nation.
So this huge crime, adultery, deceit, betrayal, the murder of several loyal men, it all stems from that one initial choice.
David choosing to tarry at home.
Exactly.
And that's why we can't read this story just as some, sensational drama. It is a profound lesson about how power, when it's disconnected from responsibility, corrupts.
Absolutely. And to really appreciate the depth of what David did, the exploitation, we have to dive into a detail that is so often just glossed over.
The religious context of Bathsheba's bath.
Yes. This takes us into our second section, and this is fascinating.
This is where understanding Jewish ritual law, it just shifts the entire story from, simple adultery to this immense violation of a sacred private moment.
Okay, so let's look at 2 Samuel 11, verse 4 again. The text includes this little parenthetical phrase, "For she was purified from her uncleanness."
Right, and that is not a throwaway detail. That is the key. Bathsheba was engaged in mikvah immersion.
So what exactly is mikvah, and why is its timing, its location, so critical for us to understand her vulnerability here?
The mikvah is absolutely central to Jewish family purity laws. It's a pool, and it's typically built to hold natural water, so like rainwater, which is why they were often on a roof, to facilitate collection.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
And this immersion ritual is necessary to prepare a woman to again be intimate with her husband after the required time of separation because of her menstrual cycle. It's a moment of spiritual cleansing, not just physical.
To really get this, we probably need to understand the intensity of the Mosaic law around this idea of purity. It's laid out in Leviticus, right?
It is, in Leviticus 15. And the rules were exhaustive and extremely demanding. The law said a woman shall be put apart 7 days after her bleeding stopped.
So a full week after.
Full week after. And during that entire time, she was considered unclean. And anyone who touched her or even just touched something she sat on would also be considered unclean until the even.
This was mandatory then, a rigorous social and religious separation.
Very. And the distinction between clean and unclean. It wasn't just about hygiene. It had these profound, almost existential consequences for the Israelites.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the source really emphasizes that being clean meant being fit for worship. To be unclean meant you were excluded. Excluded from the tabernacle, excluded from necessary religious rites, and often excluded from basic human contact.
So for Bathsheba, following these laws to the letter was central to her piety, her ability to even participate in her faith and her marriage.
Exactly. And the requirements of the mikvah ritual itself meant that this bath she was taking, it wasn't optional, wasn't casual. It was required to take place at a very specific time.
At night.
Yes. The immersion must take place after nightfall on the 7th day after bleeding had ceased. This timing at the very end of the separation period is so crucial, and it explains why she was bathing at night.
She was observing the law down to the minute.
Precisely. And that one detail just refutes any cultural suggestion that she was, bathing in broad daylight or in public view to try and entice someone. She was fulfilling a sacred obligation at the exact required time.
And the preparation for that final immersion, it sounds like it was an almost impossible level of thoroughness. The source material details this extensive pre-immersion cleansing.
Oh, it was far beyond a standard bath. The immersion itself is symbolic, it's spiritual. But the rule is that if any single part of the body isn't touched by the water, the whole immersion is invalid.
The whole thing doesn't count.
The whole thing is void. So the preparation had to be, well, almost forensic. It required bathing for at least 30 minutes, then a shower, washing your hair. Every single hair had to be combed to make sure there were 0 tangles, because a single tangle would prevent the water from touching that one strand.
Wow.
She would have had to wash and cut her nails, thoroughly brush her teeth, and remove everything. Nail polish, chapstick, any jewelry, even her wedding ring, anything that might act as a tiny barrier between her skin and the water.
And then there's a check.
Yes, a formal check had to be performed to assure sufficiency before she could finally immerse.
So if we put all that together, we have this image of Bathsheba alone, undertaking this intensely private, deeply spiritual, and physically demanding purification ritual.
In a ritually designated sacred space on the roof.
And David, from the comfort of his adjacent palace, just violated that sanctity simply because he could.
The vulnerability there is just immense. David wasn't just watching a woman bathe. He was spying on her in a sacred, undefended, deeply intimate moment. A moment where she was fulfilling a commitment to her faith and to her husband.
And the location you mentioned, the mikvah being on the roof to collect rainwater, that meant David had a direct, high-powered view into a place that should have been a sanctuary.
It really elevates his sin. It goes from a mere private transgression to an abuse of sovereign power against a ritually protected space and a ritually protected person.
And on top of all of this, there's this dark layer of irony. The timing of the mikvah, driven by this ritual separation, actually put her at her most fertile moment.
Yes, the source notes this grim coincidence. The 12th day of the cycle, which is when this ritual typically occurs, is her most fertile time, which of course directly contributed to the inevitable conception that then led to Uriah's death.
But the deepest, most damning irony is in the text itself.
Right there in the verse. David waited until she was purified from her uncleanness before sleeping with her.
That is just, it's profound. Even David, in the middle of plotting adultery and eventually murder, still had this superstitious or ritualistic line he wouldn't cross.
He had a limit.
He had a limit about sleeping with an unclean woman. He's adhering to the surface-level ritual while committing the most grievous moral sin imaginable.
It speaks volumes about the priorities at the time, doesn't it? The external, the visible adherence to ritual purity held sway even over the internal, catastrophic failure of character.
This whole concept of ritual purity, of being defiled by external factors, is something that Jesus just fundamentally challenged and dismantled later in the New Testament.
The complete paradigm shift.
So how does that contrast further emphasize David's hypocrisy here?
It really does. The source links it directly to David's failure. We can look at the story of the woman with the 12-year issue of blood in the Gospel of Luke.
Right. For 12 years, she had been ritually unclean.
Constantly.
Yeah.
Excluded from society, unable to touch people without defiling them. She wasn't supposed to be in public, let alone touching a man, which of course she does when she reaches out and touches the hem of Jesus' garment.
And her reaction when she's discovered is fear. Right. She's expecting that ritualistic consequence.
Exactly. She's trembling. She expects condemnation for breaking the purity laws, for possibly defiling a holy man. But Jesus does the absolute opposite.
He doesn't criticize her.
He doesn't criticize her for making him unclean. He doesn't go seek immediate ritual cleansing. Instead, he praises her faith. He tells her, "Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace." He prioritized her faith and her humanity over centuries of purity law.
And we see him take this a step further when the Pharisees criticize his own disciples for eating with unwashed hands, violating that tradition of ritual, not hygiene.
Yes. In Mark, Jesus calls them hypocrites for holding up man-made traditions over God's actual commandments. And then he clarifies for his disciples what truly defiles a person.
He says it comes from within.
He says defilement comes from within, out of the heart of men. And then he gives this list of where evil comes from. Evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit.
That list is a devastating indictment of David's exact behavior, every single one. He was so meticulous about waiting for Bathsheba to be ritually clean, but he was simultaneously harboring evil thoughts, adulteries, and murders.
The contrast could not be starker.
Yeah.
Jesus teaches that true defilement is an internal failure of the heart, driven by unbridled desires and moral choices. And that is exactly what David demonstrated.
Adhering to the surface ritual while harboring those internal evils, it's the very essence of hypocrisy.
It is.
And all of this sets up David's eventual confrontation with the prophet Nathan, which is the necessary pivot into the political and theological misuse of this story.
Indeed. David is finally called to account. The Lord sends Nathan in 2 Samuel 12.
Nathan's approach is just masterful. He uses the parable of the rich man who had all these flocks but stole the poor man's single beloved ewe lamb.
A brilliant strategy.
It's designed to get maximum righteous indignation from David, which it does. David is incensed. He proclaims a rich man deserves death, only for Nathan to deliver that famous, sharp condemnation.
Thou art the man.
He's trapped by his own sense of justice. Nathan then proceeds to pronounce God's judgment, outlining all the consequences. But it's here, in the speech, that we find the verse that has caused centuries of theological trouble.
Especially in justifying polygamy.
Right. It's 2 Samuel 12, verse 8. And that critical verse, the one that's so often quoted, reads, I gave thee thy master's house and thy master's wives into thy bosom, and if that had been too little, I would moreover have given thee such and such things.
And for anyone seeking to legitimize polygamy, including, later movements within Mormonism, this verse is just seized upon.
It's the proof text.
It is the ultimate biblical proof text. The interpretation is that since God, speaking through Nathan, confirmed that David received his wives as a divine gift, then God must condone, support, or maybe even command the practice.
And the source material highlights how this flawed interpretation was then explicitly codified in later theology.
Yes. The Doctrine Covenants, section 132, which is just central to the justification of plural marriage, it leans heavily on this interpretation. Verse 39 claims, David's wives and concubines were given unto him of me by the hand of Nathan, my servant, and others of the prophets.
It explicitly names Nathan.
It explicitly names Nathan and other prophets, and it claims divine approval, saying he didn't sin in any of those things, save in the case of Uriah and his wife.
But wait, if Nathan had nothing to do with David acquiring any of his wives, which is what the source material argues, then that entire theological premise of D&C 132, at least regarding David's marriages, it just falls apart.
It completely collapses.
So how do we prove that? How do we show factually from the Old Testament text that Nathan wasn't involved?
The source offers a clear, detailed, and I would say undeniable refutation, just by reviewing the biblical record of how David got his wives. Nathan had zero involvement in any of David's recorded unions.
Okay, let's walk through them, starting with his first wife, Michal.
Right. Wife number 1, Michal. She was given to David by King Saul, her father. It was a complex political move described in 1 Samuel. Saul had intended for the dowry, the foreskins of 100 Philistines, to get David killed.
But it didn't work.
It didn't work. But the point is, this was a political transaction from Saul, not a gift from the prophet Nathan.
Okay, what about his next 2 wives, Abigail and Ahinoam?
Both were acquired by David himself. In 1 Samuel 25, after Abigail's first husband Nabal dies, the text says David sent and communed with Abigail to take her to him to wife. He initiated it. He executed that union.
He did it himself.
And the next verse says David also took Ahinoam himself. These were self-initiated unions, likely to consolidate regional power after he fled from Saul. Again, no prophet involved.
And then once he became king in Jerusalem, the list it expanded significantly.
Oh, absolutely. 2 Samuel 5 later states, David took him more wives, more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem. The consistent language in the text is that David took them, or they were given to him by a political actor, like Saul.
Nathan is nowhere in the picture.
He is not involved in facilitating or commanding a single one of these marriages.
So the conclusion from our source is that the central assertion in D&C 132 that David's wives were given to him by the hand of Nathan and others of the prophets is factually incorrect.
Based entirely on the scriptural record provided in the Old Testament, the source says the application is yet again wrong.
And that matters immensely, because if your justification for a practice relies on this claim of prophetic appointment, and the historical record shows that prophetic appointment never happened,
then the entire justification collapses. These were the acts of a powerful monarch collecting women, which was consistent with the norms of surrounding empires. But, and this is key, it was contrary to Israelite law.
That brings us to the law of Moses itself. So regardless of how he got them, David was in direct violation of the foundational legal constraint placed specifically on kings.
This is a point that's so frequently overlooked by people looking for a justification. Deuteronomy 17 explicitly commands the king, "Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turned not away."
A specific, divinely mandated limitation on royal power.
Exactly. It was designed to prevent the very things that David and his son Solomon indulged in.
So David's polygamy wasn't some kind of divine exception. It was a clear act of disobedience and royal overreach, something explicitly warned against in the law.
Precisely. And the warning is critical. Accumulating wives leads the king's heart to turn away. And what happened? David's heart did turn away, evidenced by his actions against Uriah. It demonstrates that the law was there for a very, very good reason.
Okay, so if David's marriages were acquired through political means, and Nathan wasn't giving him women, then what is the true meaning of Nathan's phrase in 2 Samuel 12.8? Why would he say, "I gave thee thy master's house and thy master's wives"?
This is the profound reinterpretation that is so tragically missed when people focus only on justifying polygamy. Nathan was not making a theological statement about divine marriage approval. He was using a rhetorical device, one that was common in ancient Near Eastern prophecy, to contextualize David's immense privilege.
It sounds like Nathan was basically saying, look at the sheer scale of what you already have.
Exactly. That's it. Nathan's core message was about the abundance of blessings David had received from God: the kingdom, the prestige, the wealth, the security. Taking Saul's house and wives was traditionally how succession or dominance was symbolized in that culture. It was a political statement demonstrating David was now in charge of the entire former regime.
So Nathan was reminding him, God has given you literally everything a man could want.
Unlimited wealth, unlimited power, and yes, unlimited sexual access. And yet,
despite this bottomless well of resources, David was still unsatisfied. He committed murder and adultery over the one thing he didn't have.
Uriah's wife.
The one thing.
Nathan was teaching David about the bottomless pit of desire. It is the spiritual truth that the insatiable hunger of lust, greed, and appetites can never be satisfied. It's just inherent in the human condition when it's left unchecked. David, who could have any woman in the kingdom, desired the one woman who was off limits.
It's that constant moving of the goalpost, isn't it? If you get more power, you want more power. If you get more money, you want more money. Enough is never enough when desire is the driving force.
It's an essential lesson about the nature of human passion. The source uses this powerful metaphor of fire. Fire is useful, right? It cooks, it heats. But if fire isn't carefully contained, if it's allowed to burn outside of its controlled environment,
it becomes a wildfire.
It becomes a wildfire that destroys everything in its path. Passions, including desire and lust, they have to be bridled. They must be kept within the bounds the Lord has set.
And David had no bounds. And that lack of restraint is ultimately what led to his greatest moral failure. The message is that the ability to live without limits doesn't actually lead to fulfillment.
And this profound philosophical lesson, this idea about the emptiness of unbridled desire, is just so beautifully reinforced in the wisdom literature. Specifically, the Book of Ecclesiastes,
traditionally attributed to David's son, Solomon,
who himself went down this exact path of limitless acquisition, but on an even grander scale.
Solomon's reflection in Ecclesiastes 2, it reads like a royal audit of nihilism. He describes gathering unimaginable wealth, status, indulging every conceivable appetite.
He says, I got me servants and maidens. I gathered me also silver and gold. I got me men singers and women singers. And then the key line, I withheld not my heart from any joy.
He maximized everything. Every sensual and material desire. He achieved every possible worldly goal.
He did. And what was his final conclusion after all of that accumulation?
Behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun.
Unbridled desire, even when it's perfectly satisfied, leads not to peace or fulfillment, but to despair and nihilism. That is the ultimate cautionary tale that both David and Solomon inadvertently left for us.
David did suffer harsh consequences, of course, the death of Bathsheba's newborn son being the most immediate. But the source suggests he did learn at least part of the lesson.
Yes, there is a kind of limited redemption. The source notes that David seemed to learn a line he would not cross again. It observes that there is no account of him ever again taking a married woman.
But he remains a highly problematic figure. Which brings us to the cautionary tales at the very end of his life.
Right.
Before we discuss that final dark ending with Abishag, let's just touch on the source's explicit caution regarding David's relationship with Jonathan. It suggests we must be extremely hesitant to set David up on any sort of pedestal. Why include that specific caution here?
Well, the source material is pointing out that David's life is complex, and it's fraught with moral ambiguity that goes beyond his treatment of women. The relationship between David and Jonathan is characterized by this highly unusual covenantal language throughout their story. We see these repeated descriptions of an incredibly intense emotional bond.
And the specific reference that's often made is to David's lament after Jonathan's death, where he says, "Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women."
Exactly. So when you examine the full context of David's life, his propensity for excess, his use of power, and this intensely intimate and covenantal nature of his bond with Jonathan, it just compels us to exercise extreme caution before treating David as some clean, simple moral role model.
We can't cherry pick.
We can't. The sources argue we can't cherry pick the good parts of his story while ignoring the difficult parts, or we risk adopting a really distorted moral framework.
And that caution is absolutely necessary as we approach the sad final chapter of David's life, the story of Abishag the Shunammite from 1 Kings. David is very old, he's declining, and he can't keep warm.
And in his extreme old age, his attendants, they don't suggest more blankets or, simple comforts. They propose a very specific solution.
They sought out a young virgin to cherish him and let her lie in thy bosom that my lord the king may get heat.
They find Abishag, described as a very fair damsel, and she's brought in to cherish and minister to the king. The text then says she ministered to him, but the king knew her not.
And the source material really compels us not to just gloss over this detail. We have to ask, what kind of mindset finds it appropriate to take a beautiful young girl purely for the purpose of being a human blanket for an aging, powerful man?
Right. And the source also critiques that notion that David knew her not as some act of gentlemanly restraint. It suggests it was much more likely due to his advanced age and physical inability.
Even his history.
Given his history of unchecked desire and acquisition, that is a highly reasonable inference. But more importantly, this incident is presented as a prime, undeniable example of the polygamist mindset.
What does that mean exactly?
It's a mindset that fundamentally treats women as property. It's viewing women or girls as disposable resources to fulfill whatever need the male leader requires, whether that need is comfort, sexual release, a political alliance, or in this case, warmth.
And the source makes a very stark, very necessary modern comparison here to emphasize that this behavior is timelessly wrong, regardless of the cultural context.
Yes. The source explicitly likens this practice. A powerful elderly leader taking a young virgin decades his junior for personal use to modern FLDS practices under leaders like Warren Jeffs.
That's a strong comparison.
It is, but the argument is that taking young girls as wives when you're decades older, regardless of the claimed divine sanction or the closed culture, is fundamentally very, very wrong. The practice reflects the exact same underlying view, that women are commodities whose worth is tied only to the leader's needs.
And Abishag's tragic status as property is further underscored after David's death. It confirms she was viewed purely as an object to be passed on.
Her story doesn't end when David dies. She immediately becomes a ploy in the struggle for the crown. One of David's other sons, Adonijah, attempts to request her from the new king, Solomon. And the request is immediately recognized as a political move.
Oh, why?
Because the next king was assumed to inherit the harem. And possessing the previous king's concubine, even one he hadn't known, symbolized the transfer of authority and legitimacy. Her role was simply property to be inherited.
This overwhelming evidence of David's failure, rooted in lust and the abuse of power, it brings us to what might be the most powerful theological contradiction in our sources.
It is truly one of the most remarkable findings of this deep dive. The source material emphasizes that the Book of Mormon provides the only place in all of Scripture that accurately addresses David's polygamy and condemns it outright.
Okay, so where is this?
We turn to the Book of Jacob, chapter 2.
And Jacob is addressing people in his own time who were already seeking to use David and Solomon's lives to excuse their own lusts.
Precisely. He says that people seek to excuse themselves in committing whoredoms because of the things which were written concerning David and Solomon. And then comes the clear, unmistakable teaching from the Lord. And it directly contradicts that later interpretation we saw in D&C 132.
So what is that definitive teaching?
Behold, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines. Which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord?
Abominable.
Abominable. That single statement is the definitive counter-narrative. It explicitly calls out their polygamy as an abomination, offering no political or prophetic justification whatsoever.
The source finds it truly amazing and strange that despite this clear, incredibly clear, unmistakable teaching that's unique to the Book of Mormon.
That later church history followed the exact same path as David and Solomon, using the very verses Jacob was condemning to justify the practice.
It's a profound internal contradiction.
It is. If you accept the Book of Mormon as inspired truth, then you have to accept its unequivocal condemnation of David's polygamy. To use David's life for justification requires you to sidestep or just reject one of the most explicit moral teachings found in that scripture.
So the final conclusion drawn from the source material is that David's life, it really needs to be reclassified. It is not a moral example to emulate.
It is absolutely a cautionary tale. David was gifted with every possible advantage, but his privileged ability to live with any restraint did not actually serve him at all well. His story demonstrates that unchecked power and desire are fundamentally corrosive to character and lead directly to the betrayal of trust and the commission of grievous sin.
This has been an incredibly detailed look into the true context of David and Bathsheba, unmasking Bathsheba as a victim of abuse of power, looking at the vulnerability inherent in Jewish ritual law, revealing the blatant misuse of 2 Samuel 12.8, and showing the pervasive moral tragedy of that polygamous mindset, which we see with Abishag.
And ultimately, this deep dive, for me, it increases my appreciation for the Book of Mormon's inspired words. Its unique, clear condemnation of David's polygamy in Jacob 2 offers a truly healing perspective. It just cuts through centuries of theological justification for practices that caused immense harm.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you reflect on power, desire, and faith?
Well, David was not a purely evil man. He had moments of repentance and great faith. But his story stands as this monument to the harsh lesson that power without restraint is fatal. The provocative thought we're left with is that stark difference in life outcome that Solomon himself documented.
In Ecclesiastes.
In Ecclesiastes, you have the path of absolute power and limitless desire, which results in nihilism and despair. And then you have the path of self-restraint, of humility, and adherence to the moral bounds set by the Lord. The critical lesson to explore is why, despite having everything, David and Solomon ended up so deeply dissatisfied, while a life of moral restraint, even when it's difficult, promises true fulfillment. The scriptures provide the inventory of both paths, and they leave us to decide which one we're going to follow